So, as I said, welcome. You're here for the second session of the inquiry series from ODE. If you'd like to follow along with the slides or download them afterward, there's a bit.ly right there in the bottom. It's bit.ly/ODE-session2. So it's ODE-session2. That'll bring you right to our PowerPoint, so you can see our slide deck for this presentation. Oops. I will let my co-presenter introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Lauren Colley. I'm an assistant professor of secondary social studies education down here at the University of Cincinnati. I'm fairly new to Cincinnati. I've been here about a year. Before that, I was at the University of Alabama. And before that, I did my grad work at the University of Kentucky. So what we're talking about now, inquiry and as you will soon learn, the C3 framework, is how I spent my entire graduate career working on that project. So I'm super excited to be a part of this and super excited to meet you all.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Suskey. I'm the Director of Programs at the Ohio Center for Law-Related Education. Prior to coming to the Ohio Center for Law-Related Ed, I was a middle school social studies and science teacher. I got my law degree from Ohio State and my teaching degree from Johns Hopkins, so I kind of have one foot in both worlds. And through my position at OCLRE and the kinds of programming and education that we believe in, we kind of stumbled across C3. It's been about 4 years now since we've been kind of working through this, and just really seeing the benefits that it brings to students. So very excited to be working with Lauren, someone who was, there for the genesis of this fantastic framework, and really excited to bring this to you today and see what it could do for your students. So we want to kind of have a conversation to start things off, right? And this is always kind of that awkward moment online, right? Where, you're hanging out in a Zoom room. We're going to ask you to please unmute yourself in a moment. But we want to start by asking, what was your social studies education like? You're just remembering back to when you were in high school or middle school or elementary school. Did you have, kind of like can you sort of summarize your experience as a social studies student as a way to kind of ground us in this conversation? Oops. I'm sorry, I'm trying to monitor chat and have my screen up at the same time. All right, let's see if I can do this.
Well, I'll go ahead and start.
Please.
I always loved social studies. I was attracted to it. I really felt like in high school when the teachers tried to make it relevant, we do these scenarios and they always felt fake. And that's kind of like my biggest takeaway was in trying to make it real, they made it less real. Like if we had just involved more cognitively and really, it didn't seem authentic.
Yeah, so kind of that inauthenticity stands out, right? Seeking to do scenarios that, they want to say are realistic but aren't actually. Seeing in the chat, right? So read and answer questions, lots of lecture, right? Did anyone have like a different experience? Did anyone feel like, yeah, social studies was a place where I blossomed? Can anyone relate to that statement?
I did campaign hours for Marcy Kaptur when I was in high school, and she's still in office today. So I got to march in parades. I helped with mailing, and I passed out like mail files that says vote for Kaptur for Congress, and I
love it.
To become a government teacher.
Talk about an authentic experience, right? But what's so fascinating is you're describing an experience that you had sort of like tangential to a social studies classroom, but not necessarily in your social studies classroom, right? And Linda's comment in the chat right now just breaks my heart, right? Senior year social studies teacher was nicknamed the human sedative. That's unfortunately the reputation that social studies tends to have, right? Fascinating, despite that fact that all of us still became social studies teachers, right? But I think it is important to kind of think about that and what we liked and disliked from our own experiences as social studies students that we might now be replicating or changing for our own students. What stereotypes are out there, fair and unfair, about social studies as a subject?
Dates and memorization.
Yeah, dates and memorization. I'm seeing in, someone had to say it, right? Coach, right? Taught by the coaches. It's pointless, right? Any other fair or unfair stereotypes about social studies? Oh, fluff. Kathleen Scott says fluff, right? Yeah, I mean, especially in the way that we treat social studies now, we're seeing that, unfortunately, very often, social studies is seen as like the thing that supports ELA, right? The thing that supports students' other content. It's another place for them to practice skills that somebody else said were important. The next question I want to ask then is, with these fair and unfair stereotypes and what your education's been like, when did you learn to practice skills like deliberation, dialogue, investigation? When did those come out? Or I guess, did you ever learn to practice those? That's also an appropriate question to ask. Yeah, I'm here in college and law school, right? Science class. Does anyone feel like they never got a chance to practice those? Oh, Gloria, PD is an employee, right? We hope that that's the case. Debates in English class. But notice no one so far has said social studies, right? And yet if we think about the content we're teaching, our content really lends itself to practicing those skills. And if we think about setting students up for the real world, those are certainly the skills that are going to come in handy, right? Those are the skills that we want students to walk away having, real efficacy, with these methods of interacting with other people and content. So we're talking about inquiry, right? We're going to ground ourselves in inquiry as a way to really think about a new paradigm for education, right? A way to reshape social studies. But I want to start by asking, what does inquiry mean generally? Like when you hear that word, which we throw around a lot, right? What does it mean? And definitely feel free to unmute if you want to chime in with audio.
The critical thinking piece.
Say it again, Kyle, sorry.
The critical thinking piece.
Yes, there's got to be some critical thinking. Can we dive deeper into that, right? Because the reason why we wanted to start with this, and the reason why I think about this a lot, is we throw all these words around in education, but we rarely define them, right? Like we'll hear people say like, I really want to try to get more critical thinking in my classes. Like, what does that mean? They're like, well, kids think critically, right? But like, how? What does that mean, right? And I'm seeing some people in the chat kind of starting to unpack that, like asking questions, digging deeper, analyze, investigate. I love that phrase, find the why, right? I said yesterday that the best answers come when we start with the question why. And inquiry really requires that asking why, right? Investigations, analysis, asking questions of content. In the academic context, what would inquiry mean? Like an inquiry-based curriculum must include what, do we think? Or I guess to put another way, does inquiry have the same meaning in a non-academic and academic context? Yeah, so Heidi's saying students developing questions and pursuing investigations. Other thoughts on this? Having students discover and interpret the content without the teacher first telling them, right? So where's the information coming from? Giving a broad question that can have multiple answers supported by facts, research skills, right? So we're hitting on a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today that make good sense. The last kind of framing question I want to ask to kind of ground us in this is to ask, what does a classroom that's based on inquiry look and sound like? Like if you were to walk into a classroom of a master educator who's doing inquiry really well, what do you expect to see and hear? I love it. Organized chaos, right? A lot of talking. Students are leading. Students questioning. So something I found really interesting as we look at this, we're hearing a lot of student-centered language, right? We're hearing a lot of, emphasis on the student experience. And I think that's very different from what people were explaining earlier, right? Adam's saying the student is at the center of the learning. They have ownership over the learning. if we think back to the things we said about our own social studies education and the stereotypes we identified, students really weren't at the center of those, right? And the standout experiences like Gloria, where she gets to actually go and volunteer for a campaign and experience, our form of government firsthand, that's a very different kind of experience than the non-student centered, which must mean then teacher centered or content centered classroom. So we're going to look at how we can break that paradigm and really come to a place where the student is at the center and the student is the driver of their own learning. And inquiry really is the vehicle to get us there.
All right. So, when Ryan and I were brainstorming the session, we sort of just kept coming back to this idea about inquiry and about if there's anything actually new about it. And so when we really stop and think about inquiry, all of us have gone through teacher ed prep programs, right? We learned about inquiry in the programs. We read John Dewey. Yep, exactly. You knew I was going to drop his name. You can't say inquiry without Dewey. We can go all the way back there, right? And know that inquiry has been a conversation in education for a really, really long time. And so what we want you all to think about today as we move through the presentation, though, is there anything new about inquiry? And is there anything new about the ways in which we're going to be talking about inquiry, particularly in the social studies classroom, that sort of changes your perspective or maybe shifts from what you sort of previously thought about inquiry and about what that looks like in that classroom setting in particular? And so we're calling this a compelling question. We will go over what that means shortly, but this is going to be our question that we're going to end up kind of coming back to at the end. So really, take this and think about this. We're kind of moving through the work today and really thinking about the ways in which inquiry can be new, right? It doesn't have to look like John Dewey's dialogues from 1903.
So it helps at the beginning then to think about this, right? And the ways in which our teaching might fall into one of two paradigms, right? Dialect or dialogue. So most of our teaching as a general principle is dialectic in nature, right? There is a correct set of answers or there is a correct, point you're moving students towards. And if we think about, understanding by design, right? UBD or backwards design, we're keeping students on a preset path towards a predetermined outcome. And because of that way of education, students who stick to the path, stay in the lanes, do what they're told, end up getting to, the place of reward. And students who diverge from that, right? Students who ask different questions or see things differently are penalized, right? Because the point of UBD is kind of an impossible to fail model, right? If students do what you told them to do, they will understand by design, right? This is a little bit different, though, than what we're going to be talking about, which is a dialogic exchange of knowledge. So a dialogic exchange of knowledge has a couple of really important premises that we need to accept, right? Because inquiry very much falls in this dialogic model. In a dialogic exchange of knowledge, multiple thoughts, ideas, approaches can coexist on a subject, right? There is very rarely a definitive answer on a subject. There's always this expectation that other points of view could enrich our thinking on this. The second premise is that the exposition, right, the discussion, the unpacking of these multiple ideas, thoughts, and approaches builds greater understanding, right? Our picture of the whole gets better when somebody says the multiple approaches, right? Whether or not they personally adopt them doesn't matter. What really matters is that we're having the discussion in the first place to unpack these ideas in a greater sense. And the last premise that we have to accept is that every person, every party in the dialogue is a partner that benefits from greater understanding. And notice we didn't say every student. The teacher is also a partner in this dialogue that benefits from the exposition that the students are putting forth, right? So when we adopt this dialogic approach in our classrooms, we are creating space to explore. We're creating space to question and unpack. That's very different from the UBD model where we're saying, no, this is the outcome I'm expecting. And even in UBD, there's occasionally like divergences, right? Like you can have one or two or three outcomes, but you expect that students will learn all three of those because you design your model that way, Whereas in a dialogue, you accept at the outfront that what we know today doesn't match what we might know tomorrow, because we're going to continue to unpack this, right? At no point do we ever have the final definitive say on the conclusions in a dialogic exchange. And this really fits in with what scientists say is learning, right? Inquiry works because it's vital to bear in mind that the acquisition of problem-solving skills is the direct result of children's immature, incomplete, and often incorrect attempts to engage with the world that trigger authentic feedback and consequences. And I think this part right here is really key. Opportunities for a child to try and to fail and then try again are a crucial part of learning and brain development and should be sought out rather than avoided. So the UBD model, where students can't possibly fail, doesn't really match with what scientists are telling us are really, the ideal ways for students to acquire problem-solving skills, right? And so inquiry allows children to try and fail and try again, because the dialogic exchange that we are adopting is saying that our learning is evolving, our learning is continuous, and we may feel differently after a time, after new information, etc. Oh, Lauren, you're muted.
Yep, I'm muted to say goodbye to my kid. Sorry. So when we're talking about inquiry, what we're really sort of thinking about is not just, what this looks like or are students asking questions, but actually how are students learning, right? What are they using? How is the information being presented? What questions are they asking? Yes, but also the methods of instruction that we're using as teachers. And so when we're thinking about those more traditional modes of instruction that you all were talking about earlier, it very much looks like this sort of top brain system, right? So you've got information coming in from A, B, and C. Those might be different lessons. Those might be different sources. Those could be a variety of different things. But the information goes into our student. We're asking the student to basically sort of recall or summarize that information, and that's the output, right? So you might see that on a test, or you might see that in an essay, right? It can kind of take various forms, but there's nothing really new being generated on the part of the student, right? They're just taking the information and then giving it back to you, right? I think about that a lot when we talk about mastery of things, right? So if a student has mastered something, a lot of times what that means in actuality is that we're just asking them to present it back to us, right? And so that's very different than the bottom output model, right? Where we have that information again, those lessons or those sources, and they're coming in, but students are doing something with all of that stuff, right? So there's a piece that the students are actually engaged with to create something new based off of their thinking. So that evaluation of different evidence, that evaluation of different materials, they're synthesizing those sources, and what they're producing is something new entirely, right? So they're not just giving back that information, but they're really saying, oh, wow, I had these things. This is what I think now based off of all of this stuff that I've learned. And these are still, this is what I know now, but these are also the questions that I still have, right? And so that newness there is kind of the shift when we're really thinking about inquiry. Yep. And so then the next point is about really considering our students' agency when we're thinking about this input and output model. So are they just summarizing someone else's thoughts and ideas and beliefs, or is their own voice being captured, right? So do they have their own agency to really stop and think, to engage in their own thoughts, their own ideas, and their own beliefs when they're presenting back that output, right, to you in the form of an assessment or just engaging in your classroom? When students have that true agency, their arguments are always going to be different, right? Because no two students are going to see every single issue and every single content the exact same way. And so there's really a multitude of kind of right answers in that way. It's really about the process and about engaging students in that process of formulating their own thoughts and ideas and beliefs. And so how does this all fit in a social studies classroom? Well, in 2013, the National Council for the Social Studies published the C3 framework. It stands for College, Career, and Civic Life. For our social studies, it is a framework, right? So it's not necessarily a set of standards. This is kind of where it kind of can get a little muddy, but it serves as a framework to guide, however, standards writing. It can serve as a framework to guide your district. It can serve as a framework to guide your classroom. It can serve as a framework to guide your team. There's really not a wrong way to implement the framework. It can be implemented at the lowest level, just with you as a classroom teacher, all the way up to, we have states like Connecticut that have actually used the framework to write their actual state social studies standards. So it really can kind of be leveled up and down in a variety of ways. But as you guys talked about earlier, when we think about, well, why do we have to have this new framework? Like, don't we have enough stuff to worry about as teachers and as social studies educators? Do we really need one more thing now to layer on top of our Common Core and our social studies standards and our pacing guides and our lesson plans, right? And the answer is yes, you do. But it's because of the intent behind the C3 framework. So everything that you all talked about earlier, when we're talking about the social studies being boring and it's only a bunch of videos or all I did was take notes, right? That's sort of everything that we all hear all the time, not just as teachers, but especially as teacher educators. And so that's really the kind of birthplace of the C3 framework, was the scholars that came around to sort of talk about and write the C3 framework were just kind of like, well, why can't we just make it better, right? So why can't it just be more engaging? And why can't we have a framework that does what we know really good social studies teaching does? And so that's sort of the C3 framework is the attempt to capture that within a guiding document, to capture powerful and inquiry-based social studies, to place it at the center of those conversations that we're having when we're talking about what curriculum in general should really look like. And so when the C3 framework is written, it's great. You all can download it from NCSS and you can have your 100 and whatever page PDF of the C3 framework. But there's 4 main dimensions. So it's written as a set of dimensions, and the first one is developing questions and planning inquiries. The second is applying disciplinary concepts and tools. The third is evaluating sources and using evidence. And the fourth is communicating conclusions and taking informed action. When you first look at those 4, none of that's going to really sound that different, probably, than a lot of the things that you're already doing in your classroom. To me, that's sort of the beauty of the C3 framework, is a lot of times it gives teachers leverage to say, no, I should be doing these things that I want to be doing anyways. But each dimension interlocks with one another and they mutually reinforce one another at the same time. So they're not necessarily individual steps into inquiry, but they're concepts and skills that build an inquiry as we move through that process. And so we're going to go through each of the dimensions a little bit better. But the biggest thing is that when we think about those dimensions, like I said, it's not linear. So there's not a straight progression from dimension 1. You don't go dimension 1, 2, 3, 4, now you've done inquiry. That's not exactly how it works, right? So they're rooted all in social studies concepts and social studies skills, and they work together to blend and really form an inquiry process. So they're also really recursive. So you might, for example, start with a question, but then after using historical thinking skills and evaluating evidence from a primary source, you might not actually be ready to communicate conclusions yet, right? Like you might actually just have more questions. And so you might go back to that piece of it as well. And so they're not steps, they're concepts. They inform not only how students move through inquiry, but how we instructionally plan inquiries in our classrooms as well. And so the first one of those steps is developing questions and planning inquiries. With any good inquiry, everybody knows, every good teacher knows that a good inquiry starts with a really good question. When you get those really good questions as teachers, those are the ones that I feel like are always the ones that can just kind of hold everything in there, right? So they can hold a lot of really interesting academic content, right? But they're also really fun for students to investigate. And so those types of questions is what the C3 often calls compelling questions. They're intellectually weighty questions and they have multiple answers, right? So a student can answer that compelling question in a variety of ways. And so there's not just, again, that sort of right question. I also think about that compelling question being sort of like the top umbrella, right? So when we're thinking of how are we holding this inquiry together in the classroom, what does that actually look like? How are we connecting all of these points between all of the stuff that the kids are doing and to the organized chaos part of inquiry, right? How are we holding that all together? That's the compelling question, right? So the question, that compelling question is the piece that's sort of overarching over everything, holding it all together as students and teachers move through the process. The supporting questions are more of those bite-sized questions. They have specific, concrete answers. And, you know, when we think about those are more like the questions that have right, specific answers. Those are usually really comfortable for you all as teachers. The compelling questions is where it gets a little bit uncomfortable. But those questions really create the structure. So when we think about starting with those big questions, if you can, yep, thanks, Ryan. Those compelling questions are those big and enduring themes of the social studies. So what are the themes that sort of naturally reoccur across the social studies or across your content, right? So if you're thinking about the content that you're teaching in your classroom, what are those big themes? What are those big enduring issues that really stretch really from day one to the last day of school, right? What are those questions that really endure our fields? Those questions should also be academically rigorous. And so what I mean by that is not difficult for a student to answer, right? But they're authentic to the field in which they are placed, right? So if you are teaching US history, then your compelling question would be a question that historians actually still talk about, right? So they're rigorous questions. They are engaging students in the same types of questioning that experts in the field engage in. The other part is that it's appropriate in tone and scope, right? So you're not going to give a kindergartner the same compelling question that you would give an 11th grader, right? So, for example, there's a compelling question about the Civil War. And so the compelling question is, can words lead to war, right? You wouldn't give that to a kindergartner, right? They don't really have a concept for what you're talking about. They're not going to be able to read Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's not really going to make a lot of sense to them. And that's not a question that you would use in that content, right? It's a great, compelling question. But again, you have to think about that appropriateness in tone and audience and scale for who you're talking with. For a kindergartner, however, a compelling question like, is our community fair? Is our school fair? Is our classroom fair? Those are big questions centered in fairness and equity. These are things that the experts in our field still talk about, but it's way down at a different tone, a different level for our youngest learners that they can still access that information. I'm not gonna lie, compelling questions are super hard. They are not easy to get. Once it clicks, but it's super difficult. And they're also really difficult to write. They take a lot of really thoughtful time and effort on the part of teachers and others who are doing this sort of curriculum work, but they are worth it. So when you get a good one, you kind of know and you can hold it, but they are difficult. So just bear with the uncomfortableness as we kind of think about those a little bit more. supporting questions, these are the ones that like all y'all are going to love, because these are the bread and butter of social studies. This is where these are your like exam questions, essay questions, DBQ questions. This is where all teachers typically feel super comfortable. This is like your time to shine, is in writing supporting questions. You know, you might have, for example, in that compelling question, can words lead to war? You might have a supporting question, might be, what did Harriet Beecher Stowe say about slavery, right? And so that would be a supporting question. It has a specific kind of answer that you're looking for, but it builds students up to that compelling question. So the idea is that these supporting questions literally support students' inquiry as they're moving towards that compelling question and being able to formulate their own ideas and their own thoughts and their own arguments about that compelling question. And so the questions are really sort of I think of them as sort of the driver of inquiry, right? So if we have somebody driving the seat of the bus of inquiry, it is questions all the time. And so you've got these supporting questions. Underneath of those supporting questions, you're going to have the stuff that students do in the classroom, right? So you're going to have the content, you're going to have the sources, you're going to have the tasks, you're going to have, you know, all of that stuff that students do on a daily basis underneath of there, right? But what happens is then they move through all of that content, they move through those learning tasks, they gather information, they gather skills along the way. They're able to sort of synthesize their own thoughts and their own ideas as supported by the evidence, right? Because in social studies, we don't just care about your opinions, we care about how you're supporting your thoughts, right? And they come up with that summative argument to that compelling question at the end of this inquiry. And that compelling question does not, that when I say argument, I don't mean 5-paragraph essay. It can be that, right? We need to have our students write. We need to have them practice those writing skills, but it can be a variety of different things. You can have students present their summative arguments through a poster presentation, a digital documentary, a podcast, a comic strip, a written play. It actually doesn't matter. The format of assessment there is not actually the key. The key is actually what they're doing within that assessment, and that's that argument. That's really the key for assessing a student's ability to really engage in inquiry. And so the second dimension is the content meat of the C3. So this is all, like I call it like the gobbledygook of social studies, right? This is like where it all lives, is in dimension 2. So you've got these questions. Ideally, we want students asking those questions, but then you come and you're like, okay, well, I've got all these questions, like now, like what do we do, right? Well, this is where the content and the skills of social studies become really useful. They help us figure out how to investigate these questions that we have. These are standards-driven concepts, content, and skills. So when we're thinking of these questions, you know, I always tell my students here at UC, like, I think that's great that you really want students to study pirates. And I love your question. That's a really interesting question. Can you show me in the standards where you're going to be engaging those content and skills, right? And so it has to be back to those standards, right? But they interlock, right? So it's not like we don't do this anyways. As teachers, you're always going back to your standards and your guides, but there are ways to connect it with the inquiry and the other things that you're wanting to do. These things shape the questions, they inform the sources, and they influence the actions that people are going to do. So they're also like the content, when we think about those like content silos of social studies, right? They're the things that those people in those fields actually continue to care about, right? So it's not just that, you know, we're doing history and so we're doing, you know, standard 7, right? It's that we're doing history and we're doing standard 7, but what do historians actually talk about when we're thinking about this content? And what are those skills that students of history really need in order to advance their thinking? And so when we're thinking about that, a good way, this is an infographic out of the C3 itself, but so you might have this overarching question. So, you know, liberty, freedom, equity, democracy, all of these sorts of concepts really stretch the social studies across the board, right? And so if you have a question like, what does liberty look like? It's going to look, that big question, depending on which lens or discipline you're using, it's going to look different, right? So what does liberty look like from a historical perspective is very different than what does liberty look like from an economic perspective, right? And so the questions and the sources that you're going to use are going to shift based off that. So for like a few examples, so that history lens, right, for that larger question, the history compelling question might end up being, when did Americans gain their liberty? And so you could have students look at the Declaration of Independence. You could have them look at the Treaty of 1783. You could also, though, have them examine the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or you could have them consider treaties that were made within our indigenous populations, right? And discuss not only the when did, right? So have we actually as Americans even gained liberty yet, right? But you could also, as we've done, emphasize that idea of Americans, right? So who are we including or excluding when we're talking about liberty and of Americans and of which Americans, right? So again, it opens up to these broader multitude arguments in that compelling question, but it's based on historical thinking, evidence, skills, and sources. From a civics lens, right, you could have a question like, how do we balance liberty and responsibility? And so you might have them examine different journals or the Constitution or court opinions, right? Those are going to be the sources that we're going to use in a civics lens to sort of investigate this type of question. You might also have them consider the impact of liberty and responsibility on their own lives, right? And so for our youngest students, that might be examining their dress codes currently, right? If I see one more thing about a Zoom dress code, I might just lose my mind, right? But it might be having them like, well, how is that? How is that balance then between liberty and responsibility happening in this dialogue about my Zoom dress code, right? For my online school. You could do the same thing with certain mask mandates currently. So there's a lot of different ways in which you can really activate students' knowledge about just their own lives, particularly in that civics lens, right? To engage them in these types of questions. From an economics lens, you might be asking, does more liberty mean more prosperity? And so you might have students examine a GDP chart, comparing, the different GDPs of countries by government type, right? And think about what defines prosperity and also what it means to consider prosperity at the expense of liberty, or for whom or for what, right? So all of those sorts of questions that students could engage in from that economics lens, right? Our younger students might examine an issue like a living wage and look at how much it costs to live in their community, right? And be looking at things like that. So it's important to remember, though, that each lens is not specific to each inquiry. So you might do an economic lens one day, and you might do a historical lens the next day, and the third day you might go and, hop into a civics lens. So, or you might have an inquiry that's only historical or only economic or only civics. It doesn't necessarily have to silo. It's really about the enduring issues of those fields and about what your question lends itself to. And so, you got me, Ryan.
So kind of turning a little bit now from the theoretical to the practical, right? And so we, we're going to kind of skip dimensions 3 and 4 for now, because we're going to give you examples of those that will kind of explain them a little bit better, right? But ultimately, if you understand the purpose of questions, and if you understand that there's going to be a disciplinary lens that we're applying, then the evaluating sources and using evidence and the communicating conclusions and taking informed action, those just start to make sense, right? They're a little bit easier to grasp. So, you've got this theory, right? There's this C3 framework out there, and, as Lauren said, it can be implemented at the small scale of a single lesson, all the way up to a broad scale of the entire state standards. But that still doesn't tell you what to do next week in your classroom, right? So how do we actually take this and make it practical? What does an inquiry lesson plan look like? So in the C3 framework, we have a lesson plan template called the Inquiry Design Model, IDM. And it's a template or framework that puts the C3 inquiry model in an easy to use format. And it helps the teacher to focus on the creation and execution of an inquiry, so you're not kind of getting lost in the shuffle, right? Because if you're sitting down to plan and you've got these 4 dimensions in front of you and you've read the inquiry book, it's really easy to get so mired in some of the complexities and technicalities that you spend 4, 5, 6, 7 days with your students and accomplish nothing, right? So how do you keep yourself rooted? How do you, as we said earlier, manage the chaos, right? Inquiry-based lesson plans helps the teacher to focus the IDM, right, the inquiry design model, and it represents about 3 to 5 days worth of lessons in your classroom. So we're used to making a lesson plan, right, that fits into a unit plan, that fits into our scope and sequence. But an IDM on 1, 2, maybe 3 pages tops is actually representing about 5 days of instruction in your classroom. And so when you think about it this way, the authors of the framework often say an IDM is bigger than a lesson, smaller than a unit, right? That's kind of the sweet space in which it fits. And this is what it looks like. So the IDM template, they have a at-a-glance template that explains each of the boxes on the template. And this makes more sense as we kind of look at an example that's been built for you. So all 4 dimensions are actually reflected in this document, in that template. And so as you go across, you're going to see pieces of the 4 dimensions making themselves practical in the instruction you give to your students. And there are kind of 3 phases of building an IDM and moving students through the process of inquiry. And those phases are framing the inquiry, filling the inquiry, and finishing the inquiry. And unlike the dimensions, which are not linear, are not meant to be steps, these phases really are meant to be steps, right? They really should be the way that we think about inquiries for our students, but also the way that our students move through an inquiry. So in the first step, we define our right content angle, right? And standards really should be our guide here. We were talking, as Lauren and I were planning this session, and one of the things we said that's kind of like a misconception of inquiry is that it's like really fuzzy, and teachers who say they're inquiry-based are just using it as an excuse to not teach standards. Like, that's wrong, right? And it's unfair. Inquiry can and should be standards-based. So we're still looking at the same documents that our non-inquiry colleagues are looking at. We're simply delivering content in a different vehicle than our colleagues. So for this inquiry, we're going to start with High School Government Standard 7 and High School Government Standard 19. So we're looking at how constitutional government in the United States has changed over time as a result of amendments, Supreme Court decisions, legislation, and informal practices. And through the lens of inquiry, we're going to pair that up with the idea that as a framework for the state, the Ohio Constitution complements the federal structure of government in the United States. So I should say at the outset, this inquiry actually is available on our OCLRE website, and we'll link you to that later on. But we wrote this for a very specific reason, right? Why this standard? Well, we're rooting ourselves in this to make sure that we're hitting the course that's being taught, right? High school government was the course we were writing this inquiry for. But ultimately, we were looking for a way to respond to questions and comments and concerns that teachers have raised to us pretty frequently at our organization, which is, gosh, this standard on the Ohio Constitution is like really hard to teach in a compelling way, right? Because very often, if you look at the model curriculum on this, you could teach the way that it articulates this standard in maybe like 5 to 7 minutes of classroom time. As Linda told us earlier, that, the great sedative, right? Teaching your students that way, the Ohio Constitution, probably going to put them to sleep. So we set ourselves a challenge of how do we make this more compelling for our students? And to do that, we have to craft a compelling question that's actually compelling, right? Step number 2. And this is the opening framework for an inquiry. And it needs to be student relevant, right? What are the things that students actually care about? So if we're thinking about a way to marry those 2 standards together in a format that's relevant to students and reflects an enduring issue, concern, or debate, the compelling question that came to us was, should education be a fundamental right recognized in the US Constitution? And so this compelling question, right, if we think about starting to, analyze this, does it meet our criteria, right? First thing that comes up is it student relevant? Well, I mean, students are currently the product of education. They're going through this process. So generally speaking, they do care about education, right? Whether they like it or not, they're stuck in this system. Does it reflect an enduring issue, concern, or debate? Well, I mean, there are talks about whether or not education is or should be a fundamental right, certainly through Supreme Court opinions, certainly through conversations about education equity. There's a lot of talk about education equity right now with the pandemic. This question's still relevant, in that discussion. And of course, thinking about our standards, well, should education be a fundamental right? That implicates the idea of constitutional amendments, right? Which Standard 7 tells us is one of the ways in which governance changes. It also implicates whether or not it currently is, which is usually a Supreme Court, consideration. So now we're hitting that second piece. And because we're going to craft these questions in a way that makes students look at the Ohio Constitution, we're going to dive a little bit into Standard 19 as well. So this one question, this compelling question here, lets us do a lot of heavy lifting around our standards in a format that the students will find a heck of a lot more interesting than just lecturing them about the Ohio Constitution versus the US Constitution. Just lecturing them about, hey, there's these amendments, they were passed, okay, let's move on. Right? So step 3 then has us look at how students will answer the compelling question, this idea of argument, right? So argument really is just students answering the compelling question. And let's not forget what an argument is, right? Arguments require supporting evidence. And this is where dimension 3 comes in. You can't just say, I think, and that's it. It needs to be, I think, because. And so by asking students to support their arguments with evidence, we are showing them how to marshal evidence towards a goal, right? It becomes the why of education. When students ask you, why do I have to know this? It's no longer because it's tested, now please shut up and sit down, right? Instead it's, well, because when you learn this, you'll be able to argue about this subject, right? You'll have something to say on this topic. And we're going to say this again and again and again, but it's so critical to remember. Arguments don't have to be a 5-paragraph essay. So in this instance, the argument we're having students do is they're grouped up in 3 to 5 students per group, and they're presenting an argument to a panel of experts. They get a 4-minute opening statement, just like they would in Congress, and then they get follow-up questions from each of the legislators, the experts on the panel, about this topic. Steps 4, 5, and 6 are the meat of the inquiry, right? This is the filling the inquiry part that Lauren was talking about earlier of, the real, the meat of social studies. You need to make coherent and evidence-based arguments, and so you're going to need evidence and tasks that allow students to do that. So students are going to need a strong conceptual and content foundation to answer the argument, and they need practice with the skills of argumentation. So you're going to need to give them evidence that might bolster their arguments more or less than others, right? We're going to give them a chance to practice the skills of which content to preference in the way they construct their argument. So filling the inquiry, this 4, 5, and 6 phase becomes, our opportunity just to create really interesting learning experiences for our students. And it's important to know that this is not meant to be a gotcha moment, right? This is not meant to be, you thought this on day 1, but let me give you this on day 2 to totally change your mind. It really is meant to be like, let's just explore this topic, right? So you don't arrange content in a manner that shocks or surprises students. You arrange content in a way that allows them to actually answer the argument that is the ultimate goal. So what do I mean when I say this, right? So the supporting questions in this inquiry are, how have Ohio courts interpreted the right to education under the Ohio Constitution? How have US courts interpreted a student's right to education? What are the arguments for and against education being a fundamental right? How have different levels of government addressed educational equity? By moving through these questions, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, we are giving our students information in their backpack that they can then pull out for an argument about whether or not education should be a fundamental right recognized in the US Constitution. The tasks that we give our students are designed to help them explore the questions and the sources we're going to present, right? So they're going to look different based on the content that you're studying or the sources that you have in front of you. But the really important thing to know in this task section is if your sources are interesting and compelling, your tasks don't have to be revolutionary. Like, this is not necessarily the place that you have to create the most interesting primary source document analysis your students have ever seen, right? We don't give out awards based on how cool your activity is. But what's really interesting is what the students are looking at. And so you might find that you're going to have one or two activities that you just keep going back to again and again because they work for the sources, right? So like Library of Congress is a fantastic tool that Adam's going to show us in the next section. You could pull that tool out for almost any one of the sources your students will see, and there's nothing wrong with doing the same thing practically every day because the content changes and the sources are interesting and the arguments students get to make are compelling. And then of course we have the sources themselves, right? The evidence. And you see we're giving our students a mix of court cases, litigation, legislation, right? US Supreme Court opinions as well as Ohio Supreme Court opinions are coming in here, right? Scholarly articles about this topic. So we're giving kids a chance to really play through this content in a much fuller way, but it reflects what people actually do in civics. What do people in the realm of government care about? Well, they care about government documents, legislation, court opinions, right? They care what experts say on the topic. And so we're giving our kids a chance to actually get their hands dirty in the same kinds of sources that people who work in this field would be looking at. In step 7, we think about how we're going to intro this to students, right? How do we get kids excited about this topic and make them want to learn it, right? And so in the same way that in the beginning, we got you thinking about your own experience, that was us staging the compelling question that we're going to look at, right? We want to do the same thing for our kids by getting them excited about the topic. It's a short exercise so that kids become curious about the compelling question that you're giving them. And there's freedom to be creative here, right? You're just trying to access students' prior knowledge, so you're activating those schema that students already have, so they have a shelf to put all of the content in that you start giving them. So here we're using the We the People curriculum. So we're thinking back to Unit 1, Lesson 2 about the philosophies of individual rights. And we're starting to think about whether or not education should fit into one of those realms. There's a cool game that iCivics has called Do I Have a Right? Where students can look at some ideas that people often have about their rights and whether or not those are actually reflected in the document that matters, right? The US Constitution or the state constitution in certain instances. Step 8 looks at what next, right? Where do we go from here? And it's making connections with extensions, right? It's an additional or alternative way for students to express their arguments. And so this can be kind of where you go to that next phase. You're still practicing content, just in a different medium than you delivered your argument. So it could be a creation activity where they make print or oral or digital technologies like posters, essays, things like Flipgrid, right? Finding ways to move information in a different medium that might strike a different audience. So here we have students designing a pamphlet to convince others that education should or should not be a nationally recognized fundamental right. Step 9 is what actually makes C3 a little bit different than other frameworks we've looked at, right? And that is taking informed action. I like to call this the so what, now what. Great, so your kids have learned about education, whether or not it should be a fundamental right. Now what do they do with that, right? And this is how we break that paradigm that students say, but social studies is so boring, or this is fluff, or why are we learning this? They're learning it because now they can take action on the problem and do something with it, right? Go beyond the 4 walls of your classroom and influence the world. Make a change if you believe a change is needed. So in this instance, we have students writing a letter to a member of the local board of education, talking about their opinion on education as a fundamental right, or is it not a fundamental right, and offer suggestions about how they could change school board policies to better reflect that, right? Are there groups that are being left out of the formation of education in your district? And Does that conflict with your students' views on education? If so, how do we fix that, right? What do we do to make things better? So this is just one example of an IDM, right? And this one is about 6 to 7 days of content because there are 4 supporting questions. But there are a lot of other examples. So if you actually go to our website, www.oclre.org/C3 resources, you'll see that we have quite a few inquiries already up there. And we're hoping actually the next couple of months, Ohio is going to have its own hub on c3teachers.org where you can access these inquiries as well. But there are quite a few examples there right now, right? So compelling questions like, are state governments necessary? Do citizens matter? Should the federal government set public policy? Does representative democracy end at the ballot box? Do we need a common national identity? Was manifest destiny a good thing? Is the suffrage movement finished? Right, so these are inquiries that we have created over the past couple of years that are, very well aligned to the standards that teachers often tell us are just harder to teach, right? Just less interesting to teach to students. And so we found a way to make these just more exciting, and massive credit to the teachers who worked on these. There are a couple teachers in the room right now who've had a part in building these inquiries. This is from a series of inquiries we had, and there's a thank you section in the front with a bunch of teachers who helped us to create these inquiries and test them out in their classroom. There really is a lot of great opportunity to keep this going. So these are Ohio specific, but there are also a bunch of pre-written inquiries out there for other states. So c3teachers.org has a fantastic collection of inquiries that are arranged topically and by grade level. So here's one, for example, from New York. It's a 3rd grade inquiry. How does our culture make us similar and different? Here is a Kentucky inquiry challenge. What's so special about Appalachia? And Lauren and I actually had a really interesting conversation about this yesterday that I actually think is really relevant to this, right? Which is that if you look at some of these inquiries in isolation, right? You can see the ways in which they might give students a very narrow view or a very broad view on a topic. And so if this is the only opportunity that students have to explore content about Appalachia, well, it might have them walk away with faulty impressions. But what's really important to remember about inquiries, and that's so powerful in this, is that dialogic exchange item that we talked about earlier. And the idea that even after we finish an inquiry, it's not the end of that compelling question. And students should always feel free to reevaluate or revisit their ideas throughout your course. And so when we look at IDMs, right, we see them in isolation because, we're cherry picking to get into, our curriculum. But if we think about the way in which we build inquiries across our courses, and if we really get crazy and we actually work with our colleagues and build inquiries across the courses that our students will take, we start seeing that they connect in really interesting ways. And so students start having those aha moments as they go through an inquiry that just make teaching worth it, right? It's so cool to see things click for our kids, and you get more of those moments when you teach in an inquiry format, because we're encouraging our kids to think about what they learned before, what they're going to learn next, how they feel right now, what's happening in the world. And so they start drawing so many connections that it just makes it more interesting, as a teacher to move through this content. Oh, Lauren, you're still muted.
Hi. Okay. So when we really sort of stop, so the number one question that I always go with teachers, and I know Ryan says this as well, right? This is the number one, this is great. I'm totally bought in. I've drank the inquiry Kool-Aid, love the C3. How on earth do you think that you want me to do this in my actual classroom? And so, we're super aware, you guys as teachers are the boots on the ground. You guys are stretched way too thin, paid way too less money for what you're doing. And you're already working all the time. So how do you do something new like this and actually input it into your schedule and into your classroom? And so we're going to go through sort of the different ways in which inquiry can look, and hopefully sort of give you guys some tips that you can take away today and kind of try out into your classrooms moving forward. So inquiry in general is supposed to take about 3 to 5 days, as Ryan said, right? So the IDM model is 3 to 5 days. And this idea is that an ambitious teacher might input one of these in each unit, right? So you might come up with or borrow or steal an inquiry and place it into your unit of study, right? And that would happen multiple times throughout the year, right? Those extensions that taking informed action, those in-depth arguments, those can extend the time in which is required. But even if you're just thinking like, could I do this on a really small scale? Could I do one per unit of study? If you're 7 units a year, you're talking about 35 days possibly of coverage lost. And I say coverage and lost both with quotation marks, right? Because as you just saw, when we're moving through that inquiry, you're doing content, right? It's not devoid of content. You're not just doing skills. There's no really situation in which you're doing inquiry in the social studies classroom and you're not using content and skills jointly to investigate and, and really move through that inquiry process and towards that argument.
Okay, so this seems like an odd place to go next after that, right? But I promise it has relevance. And so this actually is something I learned this example from the frameworks of the C3. So I can't pretend like I invented this, but I think it's the perfect way of thinking about the work that we do in our classrooms on a lot of different levels. So this is a series of paintings by Pablo Picasso called the Bull Plates. And he made like 20 of these bull plates in all, but this is just plates 1 through 11. And, we think about Picasso as like the guy who put two eyes on one side of the face, right? Like, my 6-year-old niece makes more realistic paintings. Like, why isn't she famous, right? But we actually forget that Picasso was a classically trained painter. Like, he was capable of great realism. But when he sat down to actually make his own art, right, put his own voice forward, he felt like realism had been done, right? Other artists had tackled that territory and they did it well. And so why reinvent that wheel? He wanted to look at what there was that was new and exciting and interesting. And what really got him, his mind working was to think about essentialism and, how far back you can take something before we no longer know what it is, right? This abstraction process that, communicates as efficiently as possible. So he took the most Spanish symbol you could possibly imagine, right, El Toro, and he's saying, okay, like, how much can I chop out or add in before Spaniards no longer recognize this thing as a bull? So he starts with this, Lascaux cave painting style bull, and he starts adding some weight and texture and shading, and he starts refining that. Then he thinks, gosh, let me break down the geometry. What are the shapes that compose this figure? And then how do I refine those? Can I simplify these shapes? Can I pull things out? Can I go deeper into the structure? And he eventually gets to plate number 11. And he realizes, gosh, this is it. This is as far back as I can strip this bull before you no longer recognize it as what it is. If I chop off this tail, I probably have a ram. If I take off the horns, this could be a dog, right? You need all of these elements to know what this thing is. In the same way, we can strip back inquiry to its barest essentials, and we discover the essence of inquiry. What are the things you must have at a minimum before it stops being inquiry in your classroom? And that comes down to a compelling question, a set of sources, and an argument test. If you think about inquiry as requiring only those 3 elements, you could do inquiry daily in your classroom. It doesn't have to be the thing that you pepper in once every 2-week unit. And so we start getting to a place where we have different kinds of inquiries. So I'm going to let Lauren walk us through one of those very small kinds of inquiries.
Yeah, so the smallest size inquiry that we have is what's called a focus inquiry. So this idea is that it would take 1 to 2 days. It's a single question, a source set, an argument task, and then you are ending either with an extension or informed action within this. these are really great ways to really warm up students to this idea of inquiry within your classroom, particularly if they've been sitting in these sort of stereotypical social studies classrooms, right, before they come into your classroom. And they're like, whoa, like, what is this? This seems really hard, and you're asking me to engage and think, and I'd much rather just sit here and write notes. So, at that point, like, it becomes kind of an easy on-ramp, both for students and for teachers, into sort of really engaging in this work. It also allows them to just feel more comfortable with the idea of tasks, of sources, of argument in and of itself. And so these are really great ways to sort of really focus. And if you take one thing away from this sort of hour and a half with Ryan and I hope that you take away that you can do focused inquiry. You can do this, you can implement it, you can do it online, you can take this information and really, really drop it as kind of just like a done and done into your classroom. So we're going to run you through like a very brief little example. So we've got this historical photograph. And so using that kind of Library of Congress model of observe, question, and reflect, I want you guys to just sort of look at this photograph and just take a few minutes to observe and reflect and question, and write some notes either in the chat, or you can unmute and sort of speak up, but sort of, are they happy? What do you guys think? Are these women happy? Gloria, no, they look irritated. No. So when you're thinking about, no, they do not look happy, but bored, okay, don't know if they're happy or not. Think of this job as something that I wouldn't want to do. Bored, suppressed.
So this becomes a really interesting moment though, right? Where we see what our students will probably do as well, right? What we're seeing a lot of right now is no, yes, they don't look happy but bored. But what we're lacking right now that would make this into an argument is evidence, right? Mm-hmm. Why? So they don't look happy because. And so that because statement is what really distinguishes just an opinion or a conversation from an argument, right? And each and every one of these responses is totally fine, right? Yes, no, can't tell, not sure. What really makes a question compelling is if it's able to be answered. Lauren was saying earlier, yes, no, maybe so, right? Mm-hmm. If you can look at this from at least two different perspectives, your question is probably compelling, right? So now let's take what we just did and let's expand this now with some evidence. Let's put argument in the chat. And actually, can I get a volunteer just to be brave and say their argument on this? Yes or no because evidence.
Hey, Ryan?
Yes.
Okay, so here's my thoughts about this. We don't want to lead students because we're asking them, are they happy, without having defined what does happiness mean or look like. And so having some type of scope or lens, what does happiness mean in this issue? And then also asking them to consider the time period. So when I look at this, I might say they're happy because this is, at the beginning of photography. They're in a job where uniforms were super exciting. And maybe the people of this time, smiling was not like we do this day. Maybe being serious was how you showed your happiness. So I think you have to give students some some questions to think about as they examine this piece of this source.
Beautiful, right? So you just articulated the purpose of supporting questions. Right? Mm-hmm. Supporting questions become a way for students to add in context and understanding that allows them to make sense of the artifacts that they're encountering, right? And you're also making arguments for us about, why we maybe can't know, right? You're asking other really interesting questions. And this kind of goes back to what Lauren said earlier about how sometimes the answer are just more questions, right? When was this photograph taken? Where was this photograph taken? What do we need to know about the context in which this photograph was taken, right? And so, this is a very, very basic, straightforward, one single source, one single question. But we can add in some more sources, right? We can actually give you the caption to this photograph. And so we know that this photograph was taken around the year 1920. We don't have an exact date, at the Thomas Indian School in upstate New York. So a glass plate negative depicting Thomas Indian School students in a cooking class. The girls are dressed in aprons and they are standing at individual stoves. Now, with this additional information, does this change anyone's view on if these girls are happy or not? Yes, we're seeing a period of time, the context, the idea of female versus male jobs, right? Gender segregation in the workplace. Okay, so Teresa's bringing up an important point, right? Assimilation, right? Let's dig deeper into that, right? So additional sources might expand this a bit. So I found this from a phenomenal, important writer, Zitkala Shah, The School Days of an Indian Girl. So this was in the Atlantic Monthly in the year 1900. She says, I cried aloud, shaking my head all the while until I felt the cold blades of the scissors against my neck and heard them gnaw off one of my thick braids. Then I lost my spirit. Since the day I was taken from my mother, I had suffered extreme indignities. People had stared at me, I had been tossed about in the air like a wooden puppet, and now my long hair was shingled like a coward's. In my anguish I moaned for my mother, but no one came to comfort me. Not a soul reasoned quietly with me as my own mother used to do. For now I was only one of many little animals driven by a herder. Now, Zitkala Shah is not one of these girls. Zitkala Shah was at the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, but it's the same line of schools. The Thomas Indian School and the Carlisle Indian Schools are in a related, kind of movement of Indian boarding schools. Does this add any context to whether or not the girls in this photograph are happy? Let's dig deeper. Lauren, do you want to walk us through this one?
Yeah. So right here, you've got another, it's a letter out of Harper's Magazine in 1881 from a father to his daughter. So, my dear daughter, ever since you left me, I have worked hard and put up a good house, and I'm trying to be civilized like the whites so that you will never hear anything bad from me. When Captain Pratt was here, he came to my house and asked me to let you go to school. I want you to be a good girl and study. I've dropped all the Indian ways and I'm getting like a white man and don't do anything but what the agent tells me. I listen to him. I have always loved you, and it makes me very happy to know that you are learning. I get my friend Big Star to write. If you could read and write, I would be very happy. Your father, Brave Bull. Why do you ask for moccasins? I sent you there to be like a white girl and wear shoes. So again, thinking of these added complexities, right? So each source that we just sort of dropped on you in very quickly, 3 minutes. Rada, I love that. Sounds like a letter written under duress, right? Like, do we know, if, saying that he even had his friends get him to write, right? These questions about the source and about the authenticity of the source or about where that was coming from. These are great questions. And those are the questions that we would want our students to come up with as they're interacting with these sources. And as these sources sort of build in complexity, you notice the conversation shift entirely, right? So we went from like, are they happy? Well, I don't know, maybe, and they could be, right? To, wow, look, well, now we know that there's this question of women, right? And the roles of women. And now there's an entirely other question, right? Of assimilation and boarding schools and cultural racism. And so there's all of these other things happening within this very short complexity building exercise. And so when we think about using these sources or possibly other, right, you could then have students build this argument, right? They could use the evidence from these sources to come up with an answer to that compelling question. Are they happy, right? And again, in that answer, they're going to interpret whether or not how they're interpreting happiness. You could have a quick conversation on that within your classroom. And then, to add that extension or that taking informed action, you might then have students read their textbook, right? How is the textbook covering boarding schools, right? How are they covering this moment in history? And does it reflect the sources that we sort of can bring out when we're considering another viewpoint? Who's being talked about, whose voices are being used in that textbook. And you can have students write letters, right, to the textbook company about that, is that taking informed action piece. You could also really easily sort of connect into current modern day events that are affecting our Indigenous communities, life on reservations, and in particular, our current COVID outbreaks on reservations and the high number of our Indigenous populations that are being affected by that, right? So there's really important current events that are happening that tie back to these issues that you can present fairly quickly in a classroom. It doesn't take, it might take you a day's lesson, right? But it's not going to take you, those 5 days of instruction to cover this entire moment. So those focus inquiries to me really become those jumping off points, right? So those kind of small jumping off points, you can cover your content, you can cover it deeply and authentically, but you're still getting students to play around with evidence and to play around with that idea of evidence-based argument.
And this really is kind of a perfect way to show our students that sometimes there isn't an answer to the questions they're asking, right? Sometimes we just need to grapple with sources and see what kinds of conclusions we can draw. And we start teaching our students that I'm not sure is a perfectly valid way to answer a difficult question, provided you can actually start unpacking the evidence, right? We're using the term, are they happy? Rauda asked us earlier to say, gosh, well, what does happiness look like, right? What are the hallmarks of happiness? Brave Bull says in his letter, right, multiple times, right? It makes me very happy to know. If you could read and write, I should be very happy. He's saying the words happy, but we're just not sure what to make of that. And you can also see we keep scaling this up, right? We did this in roughly 10 minutes, right? But it could be bigger. It could keep on going. And so inquiry really is a scalable house, right? It expands and contracts to fill the amount of time you have and to match where your students currently are in this process. So as of right now, right, and they keep on adding new ones, but I think this might be one of the final words on this. As of right now, the framers of the C3 framework say there are 5 different types of inquiry. We just looked at focused inquiries and structured inquiries, right? The 3 to 5 day model is structured inquiry. The thing we just did is an example of a focused inquiry. But there are also other kinds that start scaling up in how much time they take and the complexity of the questions, tasks, and sources we offer to students. At the very far end, the complete opposite of focused inquiry is what we saw yesterday of this idea of open inquiry, right? In a student-directed inquiry, students make up the questions, students find the sources, students design the tasks that they want to use to look at those sources, and students determine the way in which they're going to communicate their conclusions, what kinds of arguments they're going to make, and what they're going to do with them. And it's really important to recognize that there are these different kinds of inquiry, because I think that teachers, unfortunately, feel a lot of pressure sometimes to be perfect, right? We've all experienced a moment where we feel like, oh my gosh, if I can't do it right, I'm just not going to do it, right? Or if I can't really go whole hog on this, I can't invest the time in this. But by seeing that there are different kinds of inquiry, we're really saying that you have permission to play around, right? You have permission to try different things and see what works. And at the end of the day, as you incorporate more and more and more in your classroom, kids just get better and better at it. And you become more comfortable with this process. As we start thinking about the idea of an inquiry spine, if students get the chance to practice inquiry repeatedly, they get better at the process. And courses are very often designed around curriculum, with teachers having a choice of how they're going to cover that curriculum. Well, if you have choices about how you're going to cover the content, why not cover it using an inquiry spine? And the spine really is a very intentional, metaphor here, because spines are supportive, right? They are, the guiding principle. They keep it standing up, right? They're framing because they give context to the lessons, and it's flexible. It can expand and contract to fill the time allotted. So imagine a class in which your course begins with some focused inquiries in the August through September timeline. And then when your kids start getting comfortable with this idea of not knowing the answer, right? When your students start getting comfortable with the concept that you're pushing them to evaluate sources to make conclusions, throw them one of the structured inquiries, those longer inquiries that incorporate more sources over more days and have bigger arguments. And then keep peppering in a variable model of inquiry until finally in March, you get to give your students a supported inquiry that's more open, where you give them some guidance and some questions, but you're letting them do a lot of the heavy lifting, right? You're letting them think about their subject and their content differently. So, I would love to inherit this teacher's students, right? Imagine being the teacher who gets to teach these kids the next year, right? How much more you can do, how much further you can go in their skills. But now imagine a school where this happens. The 6th grade teacher does a lot of focused and structured inquiries and supports the students on building the foundational skills of inquiry. Then the 7th grade teacher starts peppering in some of these larger inquiries. And by the time you get to 8th grade, you can imagine a world in which you're basically teaching 8th grade US studies as a seminar course, where students choose topics of study within the course, and they get to explore topics, right? I can imagine a world in which every Friday is like discussion day, and the kids come forward and they say, well, I've been looking at this, and here's what I'm thinking right now. You give your kids an opportunity to really embrace their role, not just as learners, but as scholars. And it really changes the way we think about social studies and moves us away from that, it's so boring, it's fluff, my teacher puts me to sleep, to, well, I'm in charge, so it is what I make of it, right? I get to say what social studies is going to be like. And in this instance, man, that 9th grade teacher inheriting these students, one of the luckiest educators you could possibly imagine, right? So there's just so much potential to keep pushing with inquiry and keep going deeper. Oh, Lauren, you're still muted.
It's like the story of my life today. So coming back to that compelling question, right? Is there anything new about inquiry? What comments or thoughts or questions do you all have, having sat through Ryan and I throwing 5 million slides at you?
This is that tricky interactive portion. It's hard online when we talked at you for so long.
I've got such good teacher wait time that.
Yeah, Heidi, that's a completely reasonable feeling, right? Overwhelmed, it's a lot, right? And that's why I really like that there are these focus inquiries that can kind of ramp you up to it, right? And Kathleen, I think you were the one who mentioned Dewey in the very beginning, right? It's not really new. Now we just have a language to talk about it, right? New in quotation marks is so critical, right? Yeah, PBL inquiry is a really great way to kind of standardize and structure this. The idea of subjectivity, right? Like, man, bringing subjectivity into our classes, like there's not just black and white answers to things. It's so, so important. I love that. Collaborations of real life experiences is a good way to talk about this.
Brandy,
Brandy.
Yeah. Ryan and I had a whole conversation about how we just do this in science with preschoolers and it's fine, but somehow now we think about it in social studies and everyone's like, oh, I don't know if we can do that with small kids or with, learners who have difficulty reading or, all those other issues that we sort of hear all the time, right? Like that we have to save this really good content for our top level learners, but we don't do that in science. We throw kids experiments very early on. And so the idea that you just do the same in social studies, I love that.
So there's so many the chat, right? I'm loving the chat right now because it really how often as educators do we get to be in a group of like-minded individuals, right? And just think about our craft, right? Think about the way in which we can influence students' abilities and skills as independent learners. If you think back to like the question that Art asked yesterday in his session, he had teachers vote on what they think is like their personal philosophy of education. And so many people said, I want to build independent learners, right? Like what better way to do that than to show your students that, as Gloria said, think and problem solve instead of searching for the right answer. Recognize there might not be a right answer, right? And there's just so many interesting ways that we can explore with students and give ourselves permission to teach our students that history is not black and white, right? And, we say like, oh, we've been doing this in science. Let's not forget, college level courses don't call themselves social studies. They say, oh, this is our social sciences department, right? They approach it as a science in the same way that we approach biology, chemistry, etc. Like you study evidence to draw new conclusions and ask better questions. So, I know we threw a ton at you really quickly, right? But the reality is like, how on earth do you convey all of this in an hour and a half session, right? So there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot more that we can do. But of course, the really important things you've got to know right before we end this session is that you can get CEUs for today's session if you complete the survey at the link here. It's bit.ly/survey-ODE. I'm going to go and put that in the chat. And then if you like this and you want to learn more about it, if you want to get deeper into this process, we would absolutely encourage you to apply to be part of the Ohio Inquiry Working Group. So as I mentioned earlier, we really, really want to have more inquiries for the state of Ohio, right? Based on our standards, that really speak to Ohio teachers the things that we need to be doing with our students. So we have a working group we're putting together where you'll receive more training in this area and where you will be able to, create inquiries that get vetted and, get feedback. And if you go to that link there, you can apply and we'll go through all the applications and look forward to working with, as many of you as we can throughout this process.
And I just want to say, for I saw a few sort of comments pop up in the chat as well about how inquiry can really be useful when talking about trying to build an anti-racist curriculum. And I just want to say, absolutely. There's so much that we can use in inquiry that really allows you as a teacher to challenge those previous preconceived notions of our students. And so this idea that, students come in, they think that history is progressive. It's just a march, right? Everything just happened because it happened, right? Not because there were actual people who were making specific choices under certain conditions, right? And so it's really important to use inquiry to let students really dive in and investigate that. So I think it's a wonderful tool for anti-racist curriculum in particular, but there's so much overlap and so many things that you can do across the disciplines with it.
So this is just the beginning, the jumping off point, but we are almost exactly at time, which is a miracle of miracles. But truly, thank you for being here. We're going to post a video of today's session so you can go back and look at it. We'll post, basically the links to our PowerPoint as well, so you can start unpacking some of the resources we've been mentioning. And please, please, please stick around for Adam's session. Adam's going to be presenting at 10:30, kind of building off of this to show you more places to look, more information you can get. Lauren just popped her email in the chat.
Yep.
And then popped mine in there as well. Please, please, please feel welcome to email either of us. Absolutely. I always say, I would rather talk to you about inquiry than fill out an expense report. So
yes,
email, interrupt. We would love, love, love to, get to work with you on this.
Well, and thank you both, Ryan and Lauren. This is fabulous. And every time I hear more about the C3 framework and IDM, I learn more and I get more excited about it. So I'm excited that you could do this. And thank you so much for this session today. I really appreciate your time and insights and sharing with everybody today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.